Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harita Benjamin, and I work with Manorama Online. And I'm here to welcome all of you to this very exciting session with Dr. Abraham Verghese, the best-selling author of The Covenant of Water. So welcome. Before we move ahead, let's begin with a silent prayer. Please rise. Thank you. Please be seated. Dr. Abraham Verghese's latest book, The Covenant of Water, which is on Oprah's book club selection and New York Times bestseller list and the National Indie bestseller list, is a sensation across the globe. The New York Times has called the book grand, spectacular, sweeping, and utterly absorbing. And The Guardian has reviewed it as an epic tale of people and place. Oprah has called it unputdownable and one of the best books she has ever read in her lifetime. Dr. Abraham Verghese, a physician by profession and a writer by heart, is a professor at the Stanford University's School of Medicine. He is also the vice chair of the Department of Medicine there. Yes, it is a wonder how he does it all. He was presented with the 2015 National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. He's also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Abraham Verghese has written 2 memoirs and 2 novels. My Own Country, A Doctor's Story in 1994, The Tennis Partner in 1998, Cutting for Stone in 2008, and The Covenant of Water in 2023. His novel, Cutting for Stone, was also on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 consecutive years. While his first debut novel talked about Ethiopia and his life there, the second novel is more about his roots in Kerala. The Covenant of Water, as many of you may already know, is a multi-generational epic family saga, which is set between 1900 and 1977 in Kerala. The big Ammachi of the Parambil family in his book strikes a chord with the readers, much like Ursula, the matriarch, who's there in The 100 Years of Solitude, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I think the way the young Ammachi holds on to that copy of Manorama to teach the letters, the first letters of Malayalam to her stepson is very endearing indeed. Incidentally, The Covenant of Water is also being translated into Malayalam by A.V. Harishankar, the editor in charge of Balarama, and we are very excited about this translation which is coming next year. So, Dr. Abraham Verghese's association with Malayalam Manorama, however, did not begin here. His mother had written a column for us way back in the 1960s, and it was called Sarjanum Regium, about 2 little mischievous boys, and Sarjan being Dr. Verghese here. So I also take this opportunity to welcome Carrie Costanzo, a cultural anthropologist from Stanford. She and Abraham Verghese have taught joint courses for freshmen at Stanford. This is Carrie's 3rd visit to India. She has done research on ethnography of call centers in Hyderabad. So today's program will include an interaction with our beloved author, followed by a book reading, and we'll also have a Q&A session thereafter. So please join me to welcome Dr. Abraham Verghese on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see so many of you here. I must tell you, it feels very special to be in the geography of my book. Truly quite different from talking about the book anywhere else. I want to begin by a heartfelt thanks to Chaco and Amu. I don't quite see where you are. There you are. Okay. I've known Chaco for many years, from the time we were both in Madras Christian College. He's been a great friend and so very generous with everything related to this book. So I'm really, truly grateful and very, very happy to be at the Manorama. As you know, or may know, the Manorama features a lot in this book. And it was with great trepidation that I sent the book to, waited for Chaka to read the book to see if I had caused offense. But I was very pleased to see that I had not. I thought I wrote about the Manorama with the reverence that I feel for it and that my characters in the book feel for it. Before we do a Q&A with Ashika and then with the rest of you, can you hear me all right, by the way? Yes. Great. I thought I would make some general comments about the book. I after writing The Covenant of Water, I was, after writing Cutting for Stone, I was looking for what I would write about next. And, I think I've always hesitated about setting a novel in India, especially in Kerala, because I wasn't born here. So I felt that I didn't have the same authority to write about Kerala the way I did about, say, Ethiopia, where I was born there. I speak the language fluently to this day. And yet I was very familiar with Kerala. We would come every summer for holidays to Kerala, to my grandparents' place. My grandmother and father lived in just near Thiruvalla, outside Koranjeri. My father lived in Manar, near Paramilla Church, where we just went this morning. So this was a very familiar territory, and the thing that made me decide to set the novel in Kerala, finally, was a document my mother left behind. So my mother was, in her own way, a very intrepid individual. She had graduated in physics in around the time India was getting independence, and there were no jobs to be had. And so she saw this advertisement for a teaching position in Ethiopia, and she had to look on a map to figure out where Ethiopia was. I mean, can you imagine a single woman in that era, 1940s, getting on a ship to Aden and then heading to, East Africa? I think it was very brave of her. But anyway, my mother, when she was in her 70s, by which time she had taught in Ethiopia, taught in America in junior high school, and finally retired to Florida. When she was in her 70s, she wrote, she was asked by my niece, Dea, who was 5 at the time. And Dea said to her, "Amachi, what was it like when you were a 5-year-old girl?" And my mother was just, blown away by this question. Where does she begin to explain to a child born in America what it was like to be a child in Manorama, and what it was like to grow up in that setting in a fairly big family. And so my mother began writing in a notebook, and she had a beautiful handwriting, but she also was a very talented artist, and she could really effortlessly sketch things. So she peppered this document with sketches of kitchen utensils, dresses, anything that needed some clarification. She'd have a sketch on the facing page. And of course, this became an heirloom for the family. We made photocopies, passed it around. But it was only when Mom was in her 90s that I picked up the manuscript again for some reason. And in rereading it, I just suddenly was certain I'm going to set the novel in Kerala. For many reasons. I thought that the geography is so unique. And I'm a big believer that geography is destiny. If I took the story and set it in, Cleveland, it just wouldn't work. It would be a very different story. So the geography is unique. And then I was going to be writing about my mother's and my community of Syrian Christians, which is sort of an exotic group within a state that's already kind of exotic. And not many people knew about this. Arundhati Roy's novel is obviously the best known English language work about Kerala, but it's been a long time since that book. And so I thought I'm going to do it again. I'm going to try and set a novel in Kerala. My mother was actually very excited in her 90s now to learn that I was writing a novel set in Kerala. inspired by her childhood stories. And by the way, those stories were little anecdotes all put together, very familiar, because Mom had told those stories to us when we were growing up. But they'd become considerably embellished when she started to write it out. But anyway, Mom was very excited and became my number one researcher, helping me with all kinds of things. And even in the few weeks before she passed away, she would call me up to tell me some anecdote that she'd remembered. And I never had the heart to tell her that she told me the same anecdote the previous week. So unfortunately, she died before she could see the novel be complete. I've always loved novels that take place over a long span of time. You know, I think that the sense of picking up a novel and living through generations and, you know, living through all kinds of global events, and then you put the novel down and it's just Tuesday. I love that feeling. I don't think there's anything in the world that can stop time the way an epic novel can. So that was sort of my ambition, to write a novel like that. And I wanted it to be 3 generations. The other thing that I wanted to do, and I had very few ideas about what was going to be in the novel. The ones I'm telling you about are the only things I was certain about, that it was going to be in Kerala, 3 generations. The other thing that I wanted to do was to somehow imitate what I've seen in medicine in my long career, which is I've been practicing for long enough to see a disease that just has a name, but nobody really understands too much about it. And then in about 10 years, you know, there's more clarification about the molecular basis. And then, you know, by another 10 years, and we have the particular gene, and another few years, and we have, you know, treatment, dramatic treatment. I mean, I can tell you all kinds of diseases for which we've had this sort of dramatic progression. And so I wanted to emulate that. I wanted to give this family some disease that would take 3 generations to sort out. I'm a long-time teacher of medicine, which means that I teach medical students, residents, typically not in classrooms, but on the wards as we're seeing patients. I'm sort of an attending physician, if you like. And I keep, by habit, a long list of rare diseases in my back pocket. Not literally in my back pocket, but, you know, I just like exotic, esoteric things. It's sort of a way of teaching in medicine where when there's a dull moment, you trot out a question about something, often based on these little tidbits that you've accumulated. And I'd always been fascinated by this rare disease, quite rare, but not that rare, I'm finding out, where people have a propensity to drown in the most inauspicious kinds of bodies of water, from bathtubs to shallow ponds. And so I gave this family this genetic condition, and made the medical conceit of the book is trying to figure out what is this condition, and that is sort of the engine that drives some of the narrative. I thought what I would do at Chauko's request is also read very briefly from this. There are many places I could read from, but I thought I would read something early on in the book. By the way, how are we doing so far? Are you all hearing well? Okay. I don't hear well, so I always have to check on you. The section I wanted to read was one where, you know, I've always admired it when a writer, often in the first paragraph, foreshadows the entire novel. It's a brilliant thing when you can pull it off. Example that comes to mind is The World According to Garp by John Irving, where in the first paragraph he begins with something like, Garp's mother Jenny when she was a young, you know, and in that one sentence you've been introduced to Garp who's not been born, to Garp's mother Jenny who's not yet married. You know, I wish I could recite the whole paragraph for you, but I've admired when writers do that. I had to wait till page 16 to be able to have that paragraph. As you probably know, this book begins with a fairly daring opening, which is, it begins with a 12-year-old bride on her wedding day. And the second line of the book is, the saddest day of a girl's life is the day of her wedding, said by the mother. And she goes on to say, the saddest day of a girl's life is the day of her wedding, but God willing, after that it gets better. And it was, kind of daring to begin with a 12-year-old bride, especially for the Western reader. But then, as you well know, this was true of the 1900s, which is when the story begins. What most Western readers don't realize is that the 12-year-old bride was most often marrying an 11 or 12-year-old boy, and they really were just leaving one household effectively for good to join another household and become a child in this new household, and eventually, when they came of age, to become husband and wife. But I like the idea of beginning with the 12-year-old bride, and actually to begin with the 12-year-old bride marrying a widower who already had children and who was older. I like the idea because it pushes against the grain, and I wanted to, make the story such that this inauspicious beginning becomes something beautiful. And by the way, that was actually the story of my great-grandmother. She married at 12 she married at 9, but my editor said, I'll go with 12, you can't do 9. She married at 9 to an older widower, and by all accounts, they had the most wonderful marriage. I mean, I've heard that from many, many different sources. I mean, they had a marriage full of humor and joy, and a household that was very warm and welcoming. She obviously outlived him, but she became a real beacon of the community. Anyway, the first 16 pages, the bride goes to her wedding day and then on to the new house, and the house is a bit spooky. And so I had to wait to page 16 to come to the paragraph that foreshadows the whole book, and I think that would be a good thing to read. I should also say before I read this that I auditioned to read my book for the audiobook. I know that sounds kind of strange. Why would a writer have to audition for their own book? But I think they should, because it's a red flag in general when a writer reads their own book. I mean, what do we know about performing a book? We know how to write the book. It doesn't mean we're any good at performing. And so my thought was, I don't want to see someone, and they typically get well-known actors, like Tom Hanks is narrating Dutch House, which is written by Anne Patchett, a friend of mine. Now her latest book is Tom Lake. Her latest book is narrated by Meryl Streep. So that gives you a sense of who does these kind of narrations. Cormac McCarthy's is done by Brad Pitt, The Crossing. So here I am trying to compete with them, but I felt I could pronounce some of those words better than they would. And it would just be terrible to have to hear them, destroy. Not that my pronunciation in Malayalam is great at all. I had to get a lot of coaching, but I would be better than them. And so I auditioned for it and I got the role. It was great fun. I had to learn how to pitch the voice slightly higher or lower on a page to indicate male and female dialogue without trying to talk like a woman or talk like not that kind of high. I had to learn to do all kinds of accents, Glaswegian, Newcastle, every variety of Indian accent, every variety of English accent, but not too much. Again, the thing is, just enough to let the reader get a sense of who's speaking. I mention this only because if as I read it, it sounds a bit over the top. This is what I did on the tape, so bear with me. Okay, here goes. So we've been in the bride's head till this moment, and now there's this sudden switch. Happened is happened, our young bride will say when she becomes a grandmother, and when her granddaughter, her namesake, begs for a story about their ancestors. The little girl has heard rumors that theirs is a genealogy chock full of secrets, and that her ancestors include slavers, murderers, and a defrocked bishop. Happened is happened, and child, the past is past. Furthermore, It's different every time I remember it. I'll tell you about the future, the one you will make. But the child insists. Where should the story begin? With doubting Thomas, who insisted on seeing Christ's wounds before he'd believe? With other martyrs to the faith? What the child clamors for is the story of their own family, of the widower's house into which her grandmother married, a landlocked dwelling in a land of water, a house full of mysteries. But such memories are woven from gossamer threads. Time eats holes in the fabric, and these she must darn with myth and fable. The grandmother is certain of a few things. A tale that leaves its imprint on the listener tells the truth about how the world lives. And so, unavoidably, the tale must be about families, about their victories and their wounds, about their departed, including the ghosts who linger. A story must offer instructions for living in God's realm where joy never spares one from sorrow. A good story goes beyond what a forgiving God cares to do. It reconciles families and unburdens them of secrets whose bond is stronger than blood. But in their revealing, as in their keeping, secrets can tear a family apart. Thank you, and I think now we're going to move to the Q&A section.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again. And a warm welcome to you, Dr. Verghese. Thank you so much. It is such an honor and privilege to be seated across from you today. I look forward to this next session as well with you. First of all, congratulations on the achievement that this book is. As Harita said, another New York Times bestseller, Oprah's 101st Book Club pick. Thank you so much for taking us through the genesis of the book. In fact, I have a few questions. You've covered a fair bit in your introduction, and I'm so grateful for that. I wanted to read a line from your book, which is one of your characters writes towards the end. This is the covenant of water, that they, people, are all linked inescapably by their acts of commission and omission, and no one stands alone. To me, that beautiful title, The Covenant of Water, spoke about relationships. Perhaps for each of us here, it meant something different. What did you hope to evoke in your readers through that title?
Yeah, so, I've always felt that titles should be slightly mysterious. You should not know quite what they mean until you come to a certain place in the book, and then, perhaps you think, oh, that's what it means. For example, cutting for stone. At one level, it's a line in the Hippocratic Oath, I will not cut for stone. At another level, the family was called Stone, and there are a lot of surgeons there. So, covenant of water, to be honest, I felt that I like the word covenant. It's as simple as that. And water, because, you can't think Kerala without water. But even more than that, I think, we spend 9 months being formed in our mother's womb in water. We emerge, we are 2/3 water. Without water, we die. So, water is so important yet invisible in a funny sort of way. But in this story, water could be treacherous. Water, if you didn't keep your covenant to keep away from it, it could be something that drowns you. But to be quite honest, I don't really have the answer to what the title means. I actually have had questions from readers about cutting for stone, covenant of water, asking me, what exactly does it mean? And, the answer I always give must feel unsatisfying to them, but this is my theory. I think a writer provides the words, the reader provides their imagination, and somewhere in middle space, this fictional dream is formed. But it's in the reader's head, and it's absolutely unique to the reader. So, every one of us constructs faces based on the things we read. So that's why when you go to see the movie version of a book that you've liked, you're invariably disappointed because I don't know, they cast Antonio Bandera in a role that you imagined for Amitabh Bachchan or something, you know. So the same is true of the title. I mean, I think the title means whatever it means to the reader. I don't have the key, I don't have the interpretation. I've had the experience of, with Cutting for Stone, of people sending me master's thesis on how I have used myth and symbol in Cutting for Stone and all the archetypes that I had woven in. And I always think, wow, if only I was that intelligent, you know. Because, you know, my goal is very simple. It's just to tell a good story. And, but the person who sends me the thesis is not wrong. When that is how they choose to see it, God bless them. So I don't argue with anybody's interpretation. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but I hope that does it. Okay.
I actually love how you have, borrowed very liberally from your own rich and diverse experiences, as you sort of gave us a preview, right from Tennessee to Texas, from Ethiopia to Madras, and now to the Kerala heartland. There are pieces of you in all of your writing. Another consistent standout is the role of the matriarch across all your books. You write about women coming from sort of limiting or limited circumstances who go on to overcome and show great resilience. And in this book, we have very endearing Big Amachi, who is introduced to us as this 12-year-old scared bride who goes on to become this towering force, this overseer of all of Parambil. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that your mother's name is Mariam and Big Amachi's name is Mariamma. Could you talk to us a little bit about those strong female and other influences in your life that perhaps have found their way into your writing?
I must say, I don't think I was consciously trying to create a strong female character in Cutting for Stone. Yeah. But in this book, I think I really wanted to pay tribute to, especially my grandmothers. Both my grandmothers were, in their own way, heroic women that the world would never know about. So these were unheralded heroes. They lived in their household, their compound, very rarely strayed from there. Both of them had encountered great tragedies. My grandmother in Manorama lost her 12-year-old son to typhoid. My grandmother in Manar lost her oldest son to rabies. He'd been bitten by a dog that wandered in as he was trying to protect the other kids, including my dad. And a month later, he got classic symptoms of encephalitis and so on. And my father remembers that. So, both these women had endured that kind of tragedy, and somehow they went on. Somehow they, got the kitchen fire going every morning, and somehow they got the rice going. And I think part of it was not just their strength, but the strength that they drew from their religion. It's the kind of thing that I'm envious of. I think our generation perhaps doesn't know that kind of unquestioning faith and sustenance you get from your faith. So I was in this novel trying to pay tribute to that, but I must say I wasn't doing that consciously. I think this very articulate explanation I just gave you is actually something Carrie helped me understand. And also, Oprah told me to keep paying attention to readers, to listen to what they're saying. And this is what came through, is this heroic women. What I was really trying to pay tribute to was the 12-year-old bride who somehow manages to make good. I wanted to capture some of the spirit of my grandmothers. But that's about it. I didn't really have a much larger intention than that, but it's very, very gratifying to see readers have all glommed in on Big Amachi. And I think that's just been wonderful to see. She is a strong character, somebody I admire, so thank you for asking me that question.
You have famously said that it was a book that led you to becoming...
May I add one more thing to that question? I must say that I never thought of my books as autobiographical. For the longest time I would resist that. Cutting for Stone, I would say, how can you ask me if it's autobiographical? I'm not a twin. My mother's not a nun, But the older I get, the more my sense is that it's all autobiographical. You know, you're drawing on, it's coming out of your head for one thing, and you're drawing on all the elements that you know. So there's almost nothing in there that isn't in some way autobiographical. I meant to add that. Sorry, go ahead.
So you have famously said that it was a book that led you to becoming a doctor and a patient that led you to becoming a writer. Could you talk to us a little bit about that convergence or the balance between Abraham Verghese, the physician, and Abraham Verghese, the writer?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. Yeah, I think for a generation of physicians in my era and before, it was often a book that brought someone to feel called to medicine. And in the UK and the Commonwealth, the book was The Citadel by A.J. Cronin, which is a lovely book. I see some of you nodding your heads. Not well known in America, I don't know why. In America, the book was Arrowsmith by Sinclair Lewis. But in my case, it was Of Human Bondage, which is, not overtly a medical book. I would never recommend it to someone saying, this is going to call you to medicine, because the medical theme is very minor, but I think it spoke to me. I think that's one of the beautiful things about books. I think I was 9 or 10 years old, and for those of you who don't know the book, the book opens with a very dismal opening. A young boy, Philip, is brought to say goodbye to his mother who's on her deathbed. And you also find out on the same page that the boy has a club foot, a deformed foot. And the mother dies, you realize that there's no father. All this in a few pages. And the boy is brought up by foster parents, and it's a harsh existence. He's bullied about his foot. But he likes to draw. That is one of his escapes. He loves to draw. And so when he comes of age, he takes off to Paris to pursue painting. And when he first gets there, he's really excited. He's taking classes at the National Gallery with a particularly famous teacher. But after 6-7 months, he begins to have doubts. He wonders if he has what it takes. And he's running out of money, he's running out of faith. And so one day when he's standing outside his garret apartment in the freezing cold, and he's standing outside because he's avoiding the landlady, and he's freezing because he sold his coat. And just then his teacher, Monsieur Finet, comes walking by, and he says, Monsieur Finet, would you please come up and take a look at my paintings and tell me if you think I have what it takes. And Monsieur Finet, you sense, doesn't normally do this kind of thing, but he decides to come up, looks, and says, essentially, is there something else you could be doing? Which must have been crushing for Philip, but that's what he wanted. He wanted the truth. And so, with his tail between his legs, he goes back to London, where he has a small annuity that allows him to pursue medical school, or any school. He decides to go to medical school because of his club foot. And the first 2 years are drudgery, as they always are. But then comes this moment when Philip arrives on the wards. And Somerset Maugham describes the moment as follows. Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas, and he said to himself, this is something I can do. This is something I can be good at. Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas, and he said, this is something I can do. This is something I can be good at. And, I think those words really spoke to me. I had the sense that not everybody could be a gifted mathematician like my older brother, who is a professor at MIT. And his genius was evident when he was 7 or 8. Not everybody could be a gifted artist, but anybody with a curiosity about the human condition, anybody with a basic empathy for their fellow human being and a willingness to work hard could be a good physician. That's what I took away. And so, I think that's what books can do. They can really change the course of your life. The passage I read to you, Bigamachi, essentially says, fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. And that great lie of human bondage just set my path. And as you mentioned, ironically, it was it was medicine that brought me back to writing, or brought me to writing. I was trained in infectious diseases in Boston just as the AIDS epidemic was reaching its full peak. An unknown disease. We didn't know what was causing this. Our wards were full of patients, and during the second year of my infectious disease training, we finally knew what it was. There was a diagnostic test, but the scale of this became quite apparent. But I was leaving for a small town, a new medical school, population 50,000, nestled in the Smoky Mountains. And everybody said, oh, you're going to see one HIV-infected patient every other year, maybe, because AIDS was an urban condition, instead of which, in a short time, I was following 100 people with HIV infection. And it wasn't because, there was sexual transmission unusually going on there. I had stumbled onto a uniquely American story that was playing out in every small town. And the story goes like this. A young man grows up in a small town and leaves for all the same reasons you and I leave small towns: jobs, education, opportunity. But they were also leaving because they were gay and did not want to live that lifestyle under the close scrutiny of their friends and relatives. And so they moved to the big city. They found themselves, but tragically, decades later, the virus had found them, and oftentimes their partners had died, and now they were getting sick and they were moving back. And there I was at the tail end of this journey, taking care of unexpected numbers of patients. And it was a very moving time for me, because these patients were my age. They were dying. There was no medicine for them. And I got very close to them. I mean, I actually always say I learned more about manhood from my gay patients than I learned from any heterosexual man. I mean, these were the most incredibly, talented, broad-minded, men who taught you how to be a real friend to a woman, taught you how to really be interested in arts. So it was a very tragic time for me. I wrote a scientific paper describing this phenomenon of migration because I knew it was happening everywhere. And it became a very important scientific paper, but it didn't begin to capture the tragic nature of this voyage. It didn't begin to capture the parents' grief. It didn't begin to capture my grief at watching this, men my age just withering and dying under my care. And so that was the moment that I became a writer. But I will say, I mean, everybody likes to ask me, they put me in two buckets, physician and writer, which are you? And I know this is disingenuous for me to say, but I see myself as all physician. I'm looking at the world through the lens of a physician, and it's that same lens which I bring to the writing, whatever it is. And I know that's disingenuous now. I have, 4 books to my name and 2, they've done well. But that is how I feel. I don't really feel I'm doing 2 separate things. I love medicine. The writing impulse comes out of medicine in some strange way. I don't know what would happen if I stopped medicine.
My 8-year-old son yesterday, when I was talking to him about you, he was saying he's only written 4 books. So I said, that's because he's full-time physician, and which you rightly explained. Interestingly, I was...
May I say something about that?
Yes.
You're right. It's a very slow productivity. Joyce Carol Oates has written something like 42 books, 30 collections of short stories, 18 plays. She's probably finished another one by this from breakfast, But I think the great joy of being a physician for me has been that I don't have to write to pay the college bills for my kids or, pay the rent, which gives you, a real freedom. And but I do recognize that I need to pick up the pace because the first book was 4 years, the second
I'm sure my son didn't
6.
mean it like
The third book was 8 years, and this one was 14 years. So I really need to move a little quicker.
Interestingly, I was 9 or 10 years old when My Own Country came out. And I hadn't read it at the time, but I remember very distinctly this conversation around our dinner table where my parents were talking about you and the book and how you had laid emphasis on the concept of bedside manner. And that was the first time those words sort of entered my vocabulary, and that stayed with me since. And as an adult, I've come to, of course, read your books, and that is a common thread across all your books. And in fact, in this particular one, there's this beautifully tender scene between Digby and Rune when Digby comes to be taken care of. And you write, if I may read, "Before we treat the flesh, we must acknowledge the greater wound, the one to the spirit." Could you elaborate on what that means to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I have a reputation in academic medicine, it's a lot around the training of physicians to be able to read the body as a text, to really not miss the clues that are obvious before sending people off for CAT scans and this and that. It's become too easy to do that sort of thing. But I also think that, this is not, we're not selling widgets, we're dealing with human beings who are in distress. And they're coming to another human being who presumably has some skill. But I always feel that the subtext when a patient comes to you, especially when they're seriously ill, the subtext, even though they don't articulate it, is often kind of like, "Daddy, Mommy, please help me, tell me it's going to be all right." There's a quality that you need to bring to minister to them, not falsely reassure them, but certainly to, as a human being, convey your caring. And interestingly, examining patients is part of our ritual, which in its own way, if done well, is an important ritual. So if you think about it, when a patient comes to a doctor, a perfect stranger is telling you things that they wouldn't tell their priest or their imam or anybody. In my specialty, infectious disease, they tell me things they would never tell their spouse. And all of this is in a room whose furniture does not look like the furniture in your house or mine. One individual is wearing a white shamanistic outfit, with tools in the pocket. The other is wearing an examining gown. And then one member of this dyad disrobes and allows the other to touch, which in any other context is assault. But the great privilege of being a physician, and it comes with a tremendous fiduciary responsibility, is you get to do this in the context of reading the body. But if you don't do it well, patients are onto you. If all you do is, half-assed, stick your stethoscope on the gown, prod the belly, patients are onto you, just as you and I are onto the sloppy mechanic, the sloppy barista, the sloppy hairdresser. We may not know how to do what they do, but we know when someone does something well. Yeah, so my focus in medicine has been to remind our students to read the body as a text well. There's no reason we should be less literate than doctors 100 years ago. But secondly, also to remember, this is a calling. The old term for this was the ministry of healing. We have a function behind pointing people to different lab doors to go get this test, get that test. There's something priestly about this, and I like to believe that.
I have just one last question before we open out the floor. Let's talk a little bit about the mystical elements of the book. So you have this condition, which is this curse that is plaguing generations of this family. And, there's this haunted, mysterious element to the deaths. And then you have the ghost of the late wife who's just chilling in the kitchen cellar. She actually plays a very pivotal role, if you ask me. It's because of her that the erchi olteda tastes as good as it does, at least in my mind's eye. And then you have, faith and superstition, spirituality is very evident in your writing. What was your intention with embracing some of these themes?
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, as I said, I'm not trying to impose anything on a reader. I'm not proselytizing. I'm not trying to push religion. I thought I was being true to the times and the characters. My grandmother and your great-grandmother, perhaps, often spoke of ghosts literally. I mean, they weren't speaking metaphorically. They spoke of them literally, just as God was very concrete to them in a way that I think is a bit more of a struggle for many of us. So I don't think I was doing anything that I felt was manufactured. In fact, I was really trying to be true to the times. I think both my grandmothers, in their own way, had one foot in the spirit world in a strange sort of way. My grandmother in Manar, who was widowed earlier, there'd always be evening prayers, and at the end of the evening prayers, she'd be on her knees and she'd be sobbing, and it would go on for some time until my father, because we were there with my father, would say, Madi Amachi, Karakam, but in that time she was sobbing. What was she doing? She was talking to her dead husband, her dead son. She was, so I wanted to convey that as, I wanted it to be as real as it felt to her for my characters. I don't think it was just putting it in there to entertain. I really felt that my grandmother, believed and was talking to them.
So I think we can open out for questions from the audience.
Can I sit and talk?
Please.
I'd like to remind you of your college days, medical college in Chennai. Dr. A.M. Selvaraj was one of your examiners. And after your viva, he had come home for lunch. So he was talking to us about you and how well you answered the questions. In other words, he was all praise for you. Suddenly, I find that you are more interested in writing than practicing medicine.
Well, thank you for sharing that anecdote with me. I actually paid her to say all that nice stuff. No, I don't think I'm more interested in writing. I think that, to me, writing is a way of, especially with my first two books, which were nonfiction, they were a way of, processing the emotions I felt in medicine. In the first instance, the emotions of caring for people with HIV who are dying. The second book, The Tennis Partner, is the story of doctors and drugs, addiction in medicine, which is, is not uncommon and takes very peculiar forms. Anesthesiologists favor narcotics like morphine and fentanyl. Emergency medicine physicians always like the cocaine, the sort of the dopamine-releasing drugs, and across the board it's alcohol. But the reason I wrote about that is because my former medical student, who was a former tennis professional before he joined medical school, and so we had a strange relationship where on the wards I was his professor, but on the courts he was my professor. He taught me, not taught me, but we played a lot. When he succumbed to drug addiction, this whole problem became real to me. I don't feel, the short answer is, I don't feel that I'm abandoning medicine, but that my writing is a way of my processing medicine. And what is medicine but life plus? Life on steroids, it's just life at its most acutely observed. By the way, Dr. Salvaraj was one of the most colorful attendings we ever had. He had often wore a bow tie, these wonderful suits. He was. I never knew that he even knew I existed, even though I'd rotated on his ward. So, in all seriousness, thank you for sharing that anecdote with me. Precious.
My name is Jamu, avid reader of your books. I was just sort of reading up about you before coming here, and there was this, you just raised that point about bedside manner, So do you think that today the bedside manner is sort of giving way to, AI and, things, machines and stuff like that? And I read somewhere that someone had criticized you for being, for carrying on. Yeah, criticized you for carrying on about the bedside manner. I mind you, I am for the bedside manner. So I just like to, your take on that.
Yeah, it's very much threatened, and I may well be fighting a losing battle, but I kind of like making noise and irritating people about this thing. But technology has become, at least in America, I can't speak for here, it's corporations have taken over medicine, and they buy very expensive technology, like expensive MRIs, CAT scans, and Da Vinci robot surgical things, and then they put pressure on you to use them. So I think we've been really, we've been sort of pushed into a system that none of us are very happy with. And the easiest thing to shed is bedside medicine. It's bedside medicine, if done with skill, can be cost effective. You can order better, you can be more selective about your tests and ask better questions of your tests. Not what the hell's going on, but I know that there's a heart murmur of aortic stenosis. I want to know the valve size, so I'm going to get an echo. You provide the person doing the test with good information. So, it may well be that it's too late. Sometimes I feel that way. But, I kind of enjoy tilting at windmills. It's fun.
Hi, my name is Josie. I just want to know why you have invested baby mall with so much thyroid problems. Is it because you find a lot of it in Kerala?
It's interesting. I never thought about the fact that you're right. There's a lot of thyroid problems in this book.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's hyperthyroid, there's a big goiter, and then there's hypothyroidism. No, I think it's just common. And a massive goiter on the surgical table is the most terrifying thing because, it seems to be alive, ready to bleed out on you. So I think I'm just an impressionable medical student, and, things have stuck in my head and they won't go away, so I bring them out. I was sharing with Shako earlier that the character Baby Moll, I was visiting a relative who I've known for years. I was a child. I was 12. I'd known that family for all the summers I'd been coming. And for some reason, I went to their house as opposed to the uncle who usually would come over to our house. I went there and I was chatting with him, and somehow I was wandering around the house. I turned a corner and there was a bench with a woman who was, this high, but clearly old. And it was a shock. It was a bit, I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know if I imagined this. And I went home and my mother said, we're the same age. And she was born with hypothyroidism. Eminently treatable now, but you have to treat it in that window. So no, I don't think I have a particular fascination with thyroid. Maybe I do, because I had half my thyroid out for a nodule, so who knows. What I've learned is that when you sit down to write, you're not in control sometimes. The subconscious is doing all these things, but you have to sit down, you have to be writing, and then when you do, the right brain or the muse kicks in. And sometimes things like this, when you point out, I wonder, how much did my thyroid, that site, all these things play into it? So you may well be right. Thank you.
And Baby Moll's dance in the moonlight. She puts on her finery and her jewelry and she dances. Does it recall days in Nigeria more than Kerala?
That came from my head. That's not real. So yeah, that's made up. Question back there.
My name is C.P. Maman. I just want to know your opinion on the role of generative AI going forward. I, for one, am absolutely sure the role of the doctor is not going to be diminished in any way, and it will only be a tool in your hands to do more good for the world. But what is your take on that?
Yeah, this is all we seem to discuss of late. I think it's a moment even more important, I think, than the discovery of antibiotics. It's a moment even more important than the discovery of the transistor or the chip. It's a real inflection point in our future, especially generative AI. But in a selfish view, there are aspects of what AI can do that will make my life easier. For example, in America, there's so much pressure on documentation. You see the patient, and then you're spending all this time being the highest paid clerical worker in the world entering data, because this electronic medical record was never created with this user in mind. It was created for billing. It's all it was created for. So there are many sort of mundane tasks that we shouldn't be doing, and I think AI can easily take over that. The only trouble is when we do these data entry ourselves, when we are pushed from above to make sure we say the key words that allow us to bill at this level as opposed to this level. So there's a kind of moral injury that we keep perpetrating. And if you really get the truth and AI captures what we really do, it's going to be a major drop in income. But I share your fears about generative AI. I mean, I think it's going to be a wonderful ally for a physician. I do not have the capacity when I see a patient to, in one instant, sort of absorb their entire medical history as it exists on the chart, every single image, every single lab test, to see the trends. So it's going to be a fantastic tool. We have an entity at Stanford where if you're dealing with a rare-ish patient, you can literally click a green button and see all the patients we've ever treated with that condition at Stanford and ask the question, if I use this antibiotic in the setting of a kidney creatinine level of something with this disease, what happens most often? And boom, you get an answer. So in that sense, it's a very exciting time, but I think there's a lot of concern at the other level in terms of distortion of truth and the ways people are going to manipulate it. They already are. So, but it's too big a subject for us to take on right now. But thank you for bringing that up.
So I'm Simi. I'm a gynecologist. So I'm very thankful for one line in this book: "Tread softly, Digby. No surgeon is infallible." I have underlined, starred that message because most often, like when I was reading this book, when that Dr. Claude was planning to put a nick on the aneurysm, I was like, no, don't do that. But like sometimes mistakes happen, and sometimes we are all humans, and sometimes we judge the other people who have done something wrong, but it is very common or very human to do these things. There was like a line which was very, very therapeutic for me. I wanted to thank you for that line.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I must say, I mean, this is not directly related to your comment, but since when you were introducing me, you had mentioned the New York Times and all the beautiful things it said about me. The New York Times review was written by someone I know. He said a lot of beautiful things about me, but he also took a lot of shots at me, if you read it carefully. But one of the things he said about me was, about the writing was, all my characters are good. There are too many good people in this story. And, I thought that was sort of a strange thing to say. He says there's not enough evil, it's all, everybody's noble-minded. But, I actually think of the world as being full of well-intentioned people. We all make terrible mistakes. And I identify very closely with Philippos. We make terrible mistakes, but you can redeem yourself. You spend the rest of your life redeeming yourself. So, I think that reflects my philosophy. I'm not sure it connects with your comment, but I think it kind of does. But thank you so much for saying that.
Good afternoon, sir. It's been an absolute privilege to hear you bring a book that we all loved to life. My name is Reshma. My question is directed purely to the physician in you rather than the author in you. To repeat a beautiful quote of yours, you had said that, not everybody can become a painter or an artist. You have to be born with a certain level of innate talent. But, the ability to emote or empathize with your fellow human being and the ability or the willingness to work hard can make you a doctor. Now, in today's day and time, when corporates have taken over the world of medicine, it's a number game. You have litigious cases being dropped at doctors left, right, and center. For the future generation, say if you were to advise my kids, do you still believe that that is one piece of advice that you would give them? Or do you feel that they need to be made of sterner stuff to deal with this profession? Is it just a calling-based need, or do you think you need steels of iron to continue this profession?
I do think that there are many challenges coming. And clearly the medicine I practice is not going to look anything like the one that's coming. But then neither did the medicine I learned in Madras Medical College have any resemblance to what we're now doing. So I think change is part of what medicine has always managed to take in, I do think it's threatened. But I also think that there's enough pushback from patients as well as from physicians. My house staff at Stanford Hospital have formed a union, which was unthinkable when I was, a resident. More and more doctors are sort of saying, we're not going to do this for you, and there's enough of us that you can't just fire me and hire somebody else. So, I think I'm an optimist. I think the pendulum will swing back. I don't know what the shape of medicine is going to be like. I mean, there are parts of it that I'm very glad that I lived the age I lived through. I'm very glad that I'm not. I mean, part of me wants to be a young physician again, do it all over again. But I feel like I lived through the best of times, the most interesting times. And, I'm not sure I want to be a young physician right now, but that may be an unfair statement. But I'm very hopeful for medicine. That doesn't mean I have given up on it in any way. So I think it'll survive, but it needs, resilience, iron, as you say, to push back against the corporate entities that are trying to practice medicine.
Thank you, sir.
I'm from Kottayam. I love this place. I love the wonderful family I have here. But I'm also a family physician who's worked in Iowa City that I know you're familiar with. I've lived there for 30 years. When I read the book, and I still have another 200 pages to go, so I hope I won't get any, reveals before today. When I read it, what I love most is your descriptions of Kerala and the history of Kerala. So much of which I know and I've experienced, but the way you say it, it's just incredible. Coming from Tamil Nadu to Kerala, and how you describe the change when you come from that place to this is something that I experienced 3 times a year when I came home from boarding school. But the way you describe it is just, it just brings it all out in ways that I never could. And I'm wondering, does an audience from somewhere else, have you heard, those parts of the book bore them, or do they love it as much as I do? That's the best part of it for me.
So forgive me, I wind up lip reading a fair amount, and it's a little challenge with that. So I'm going to have her paraphrase this for me.
How important was it for you to transport your readers who are largely alien to Kerala to understanding what Kerala, and you touched upon themes like social upheavals, the caste system, family, foods, parts of Kerala that are perhaps alien, even the language, to an outside audience. Was that challenging for you in any way, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. I'm sorry that I didn't hear you right off the bat. I guessed where you were going. Yeah, it's challenging, but it's also necessary. I think readers love to get a sense of place, more than just saying Kerala. You have to make them feel it, breathe it, and make their mouth water when they read about, and, you've really got to make it visceral for them. Similarly, I think, writing about medicine is a way of making something very concrete. Readers always love something that's procedural. For example, stories set in police stations or detective agencies, or like Tom Clancy, submarines, the details of submarines. So I think that with my writing, with Kerala, I want it to be very, very palpable. So you have to write a story that has a strong sense of verisimilitude, that it feels real. After all, you're asking the reader to suspend their disbelief and enter this world with you. And so you have to make it so real that they never for a moment say, I'm reading this made-up story, and, they have to feel like they're in the world. And the writer John Gardner talks about the word profluence. You want them to feel compelled to turn the page. What's next? What next? Not just from like a murder mystery, there's a dead body, who did it, but from a sense that you've entered a world, and the world is facing a particular conflict, and you want to see how this is resolved. So that requires great detail. I remember hearing in medical school and in the Iowa Writers' Workshop, God is in the details, which is, I think, true.
We have one question from Harishankar, who's translating your book. right now. So
I'm sorry, this is not about my translation effort, but I think there is an undercurrent of spirituality in the whole novel. So you can even come across quotes from the Bible, and Dr. Boon's philosophy is based on Christianity. It's a blend of Christianity and Hindu philosophy, so to say. It is directly mentioned like that. At the same time, you don't hesitate to find laughter in the great religious event like Manorama convention. I really enjoyed reading that chapter and enjoyed hearing you on Audible, that audio of you. It was very hilarious. What do spirituality and religion mean to you? That is one question. But I have another question also. There are many deaths in the novel, so many deaths, and some of them happen abruptly without any warning music, so to say. There is no background music. They suddenly die, people. Does this have anything to do with you being a doctor? Because you encounter so many deaths in your life, career. That's all.
Well, thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. Let me start with the last question about the deaths, because a lot of people bring that up. There's so much death in your book, and I mean, I don't know. I think I'm describing an era when there was a lot of death. As I described to you, my grandmothers both lost children. I mean, you know, as a father, I can only imagine that pain. And yet it was commonplace. As you know, it was commonplace in the 1900s for families to lose one or more children. So, you know, I think as a physician, I'm much more conscious of death than the reader, perhaps. I don't know. But life is a terminal condition. I hope that's not a surprise to you. I mean, you know that. So, you know, we're all here on borrowed time. And it's actually happening more frequently than you and I realize. You know, a dear friend of mine who I was supposed to meet here passed away last week. A shock to the system. So I don't think that I'm introducing more death than, and I certainly am not gratuitously killing a character, you know, to entertain the reader. In fact, every single time I revised the passage to do with the death of certain people I won't name because I don't want to spoil it for the reader who has not read the book, I would be in tears. It would be very, very hard for me, which I think is a sign that it was as tragic as it felt, you know. And I don't quite know how I would decide that someone would die. It was never quite planned. It just seemed organic because, as I said, you know, we don't live forever. Life is a terminal condition. Some of them died prematurely, some died tragically, but that too is the real world we live in. Yeah. But thank you for that. The earlier part of your question was about spirituality, and you know, again, I think I'm being true to the times, describing spirituality, the Bible, quoting, but I suppose, you know, making fun of some aspects of it is also, that might just be me. That's a way to sort of entertain myself, if you like. But I love the image of Uplift Master translating. But I'm told this is a true story. I mean, the preacher Stanley John was the first to bring a microphone to the Manorama convention. Before that, you had, you know, the speaker would speak, a relay master would pick it up, repeat to the crowd behind, and on it would go. And by the time it came to the end, it was something completely different. And somehow that knowing that, and my mother having told me about some of the translators that she'd heard, I just went with it.
My question is also, I mean, same as Hari's, you know, about death, and particularly Nainan's death. It was extremely brutal, and I had to, like, you know, skip through some words because I couldn't get through that. And then I remember that you're a doctor, you're probably seeing so much death, but what kind of made you kill Nainan like that? It was too brutal.
Yeah, you know, I really don't know. I think, I always say this, the act of writing is utterly mysterious. You know, you sit down, I'm not the kind of writer who has the whole story mapped out. I wish I did. It would make my life much easier. And in fact, in my in my house where I write, which is the living room, I have this big whiteboard where I sketched out the whole story. And I like to sketch. And then I'd start writing and the story would take another direction, so then I would have to take a photograph of the board, wipe it out, start again. I'll just say that whenever deaths happened, they felt organic. They felt true to the story. It's hard for me to explain. But for what it's worth, I knew of a death in Kerala or close by exactly like that. Maybe it's stuck in my mind, you know. When I was a child, when I was a teen in Ethiopia, two very young boys, children of school teachers that we knew, they were teaching in this big school in Ethiopia that had a swimming pool. And the 5-year-old and the 3-year-old were playing with other kids, and the 3-year-old fell in. The 5-year-old went after him, and the other children eventually came back to the mother and said, "Your boys are playing in the water and they won't come out." Yeah, that image is really, I'll never forget that. Long after the parents left for Zambia and they had 2 more kids, they just couldn't be in that country anymore. I would go to the graves. I was just so touched by that. And that image has recurred in 2 books now. Probably would recur again, you know. So the short answer is, it's partly the things that have moved me. It's partly the story doing what it does. I wish I had a better answer than that.
If I could just speak to what she said, actually, I'd like to read a quote by Andrew Solomon, who, in his review of your book for the New York Times, he writes, and I quote, "It is a better world for having a book in it that chronicles so many tragedies in a tone that never deviates from hope." Somehow, despite there being an overwhelming sense of loss, every moment of grief is offset by an even more overpowering sense of hope and redemption. And that was such a personal connect for me with the book, in fact. Was hope one of the themes that you chose to advocate, or do you, through all your stories? Is that?
I think, like I said, I really don't think in terms of themes or advocating particular tracks. But I'm sure that it reflects my view of the world. I am hopeful. I am an optimist. And I think that, sometimes difficulties, tragedy, they actually lead to something greater. It's not what you wanted to happen, but it's how it happened. Someone said to me the other day, God only shows you a little bit of what's ahead. Because if God showed you everything that's ahead, you would give up. And for me, this book is a perfect example. I had a very checkered history with this book. I got a big advance from a publisher. I was writing this book, and then I was way past their deadline, which is not a big deal. But more than that, I felt that the editor and I just didn't share the same vision. So at some point, I broke with the contract with the publisher. I then owed them, I still owe them a huge amount of money that I have to pay back. And I went fishing around for another publisher, and now I'm a tainted commodity. And by God's grace, I found the one editor who I thought had the best vision for it, and he was wanting to do it. And his name is Peter Blackstock. He did The Sympathizer, he did Shuggie Bain. And one of the first things he said to me was, the story needs to be as long as it needs to be. And so finally, through him, with his editing, the book got done. And that would have been enough for me. I thought the book was in danger of never being published. I came to Paramala to be thankful for getting the book done. I took a vow, if I ever get through this mess, and it was a mess for so long. So, right now we're focusing on the success, on the good things that have happened, but there was a lot of turmoil. And if anybody had told me I'd be going through all that, I would never have started this book. So hope comes out of pain, and hope gets you past pain. So what can I say? Being here is absolutely magical. This feels like the completion of a whole circle with this book. So if I don't get a chance to, may I just say thank you to all of you for being so engaged, for being such wonderful readers, and just our short conversations, I can tell that you really care about this, and that means so much to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verghese. And we wish you a continued success, and may you only know successful stories and no more turmoil. I hand over to you, Harita. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham Verghese, for joining us today and accepting our invitation. I think all of us had a wonderful time listening to him, and it was beautiful to hear you, narrate the excerpts from your book. And a big word of thanks to our moderator, Ashika. Incidentally, for those of you who are uninformed, Ashika's mother and Dr. Verghese had studied together back in Madras. So they go way back. And thank you to our wonderful audience. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but unfortunately the time doesn't permit us to go ahead. So thank you for being a wonderful audience, and good evening to all of you.